The blinds opened themselves at 6 a.m., exactly. Ethan Carter didn't remember the last time he'd opened them himself. The apartment AI, a soft voice that called itself home, handled that now, along with the coffee, the temperature, the news feed projected faintly onto the ceiling while he blinked himself awake. "Good morning, Ethan," Holmes said. "Your happiness score is at 61%, down 4 points from yesterday. Would you like a mood lift playlist?" "No," he said the way he said it every morning. "Noted. Your shift begins at 8. Weather is clear. Air quality is optimal. Your health score requests 12 more minutes of sleep than you received." He sat up anyway. 30 stories below, the city was already awake, not with noise, not really, but with motion. Autonomous vehicles slid through traffic lanes like beads on a wire. Delivery drones threaded between towers in perfect, silent formation. Somewhere out there, 5 corporations were quietly running the world, and nobody had voted for any of it, because nobody had needed to. It had happened gradually, the way water finds every crack in a foundation. The coffee machine hissed. Holmes had already selected his blend based on his sleep quality. He drank it without tasting it. In the mirror, his health score blinked in soft blue numbers across the glass. Cardiovascular, nominal. Stress, elevated. Recommended action. Breathing exercise, 4 minutes. He didn't do the breathing exercise. He got dressed instead, in the gray uniform of Halden Provisions, and he thought, not for the first time, about land. Real land. Dirt he could put his hands into that wouldn't ping a location alert. It was a stupid thing to want. Private land hadn't existed in decades. Everyone he'd ever mentioned it to had laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at a child who says he wants to be an astronaut. "Your transport has arrived," Holmes said. Ethan looked at the blinking blue numbers on the mirror one more time, at his own tired face behind them, and went downstairs to become invisible for another day. The autonomous vehicle was already waiting at the curb, door open, interior humming with the low charge tone that meant it was billing his account by the minute. He climbed in, and it pulled away before he'd even finished sitting down. Billboards streamed past the windows in that endless, cheerful scroll. "Upgrade your AI companion, now with emotional memory. Your subscription expires in 3 days. Renew to avoid service interruption. Your happiness score has dropped. Talk to someone. Talk to US." A drone police unit passed low over the street, its scanner light sweeping the sidewalk in a slow blue arc, reading faces, reading gates, reading whatever it was they read. Nobody looked up anymore. Looking up used to mean something. Now it was just weather. At Halden Provisions, the doors recognized him and slid open with a chime. Robots stocked the shelves in smooth, economical movements, arranging protein bricks and nutrient gels with more care than most people gave anything anymore. A cleaning unit polished the floor in slow figure eights. Near the exit, a security drone hovered at eye level, motionless, patient. Ethan took his place at the one register that still had a human behind it. "Why do they even keep you?" a coworker had asked him once, only half joking. "You're slower than the kiosks. People like a face," Ethan had said. "Even a nothing face like mine." It was true. Customers barely spoke to him, most transactions were silent, a tap of a wrist implant, a blink of confirmation, but every so often someone would meet his eyes for half a second, and something in their shoulders would ease, just slightly, like a held breath finally let go. He was proof, without meaning to be, that a human being could still stand in one place and be trusted. The overhead screens cycled through the morning broadcast, the same reassuring loop that played in every store, every waiting room, every elevator in every tower in the city. "Remain calm," the anchor said, her smile a fixed, gentle thing. "Domestic extremist activity remains low but ongoing. If you observe unauthorized portals or spatial anomalies, contact security immediately. Remember, freedom exists because of the network." Ethan scanned a nutrient gel, said nothing, and let the day happen to him. By noon the store had gone through its usual rhythm, a trickle of customers, a lull, the low hum of robots working. Ethan ate his lunch alone in the break room, a windowless space with a single vending unit and a chair that had long since lost its cushioning. "You look like a man who wants to say something," said Priya, the only other human employee left on his shift, dropping into the seat across from him. She managed inventory reconciliation for 3 stores from a terminal that could have been anywhere, but she still came in, she said, because the silence at home got to be too much. "I'm always thinking about something," Ethan said. "That's not an answer." He turned his cup in his hands. "You ever think about how none of this is ours? Like, actually ours. The apartment's a subscription. The car's not mine. Even my face is on file somewhere, being scored." He shook his head. "I used to think that was fine. Now I don't know." Priya's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped a register. "You want to be careful saying things like that. Even in here." In here meant nowhere, technically. The break room had no visible cameras. But everyone had learned, the way you learn to avoid a hot stove, that visible cameras were never the only kind. "I'm not saying anything," Ethan said. "I'm just tired." "Everyone's tired," Priya said, gentler now. "That's kind of the whole design, isn't it? Tired people don't start anything." He almost laughed. It wasn't funny, but it was true enough to feel like relief, the way true things sometimes did. He thought about telling her about the land, the stupid, impossible dream of dirt under his fingernails and no signal reaching him, but he didn't. He'd learned that from experience too, that some dreams shrank a little every time you said them out loud to someone who didn't believe in them. His shift alert chimed. "Break over. Get home safe," Priya said, already turning back to her terminal. "Always do," Ethan said, and went back out to his register, to the soft chime of the doors, to another 6 hours of being a reassuring, ordinary face in a store that barely needed him and somehow couldn't do without him. Rain had started by the time his shift ended, a thin gray drizzle that turned the city's lights into long, smeared reflections on the pavement. Ethan's transport arrived on schedule, doors swinging open, and he climbed in gratefully, tired in that specific, hollow way that came from standing still all day while pretending to be busy. "Good evening, Ethan," the vehicle said, in the same pleasant, sexless voice all the city's systems seemed to share. "Your happiness score is 60%. Would you like ambient music for your commute?" "Sure," he said, mostly to stop it from asking again. Soft instrumental tones filled the cabin as the car pulled into traffic, merging seamlessly with the endless stream of identical vehicles. Ethan watched the city slide by, towers vanishing up into low cloud, their windows glowing gold and white and blue, 1,000 lives stacked on top of each other, each one probably feeling as alone as he did. He thought about Priya's words. That's kind of the whole design, isn't it? Somewhere below the tower line, in the narrow service street the transport was cutting through as a shortcut, something happened that his eyes almost refused to register. A flash of blue light, not like anything electrical, not like a drone scanner or a billboard's glow, but deeper, stranger, like light bent around something that wasn't supposed to exist, bloomed for half a second in an alley between 2 shuttered storefronts. The transport systems reacted immediately. "Unauthorized energy signature detected," the car said, its pleasant tone unchanged even as the door locks engaged with a heavy click. "Citizen, please remain inside your transportation. Security drones are en route. This is a standard precaution." Ethan stared at the alley. The blue light was already fading, but he could have sworn, just for a moment, he'd seen shapes moving through it. Not walking into it. Not walking past it. Walking through it. "Ethan," the car said, gentler now, almost soothing. "Please remain calm and stay seated. This will only take a few minutes." He looked at the door handle. He looked at the alley. For 27 years, he had never once done anything the city hadn't already scheduled for him. He opened the door. It wasn't dramatic. There was no alarm, no shriek of violated protocol. Just a small mechanical protest as the manual release fought the lock, and then the doors swinging open into the rain, and Ethan Carter stepping out onto a street he wasn't supposed to be standing on. "Ethan, this is not recommended," the transport said, its calm never wavering even as its calm became, somehow, the most unsettling thing about it. "Please return to the vehicle. Security drones will arrive in approximately 90 seconds. He didn't return to the vehicle. The rain came down harder as he crossed toward the alley, his shoes splashing through gutter water that reflected the gold light of a nearby ad screen. Subscription expiring, it reminded him, utterly indifferent to the fact that he was doing the first illegal thing of his entire life. The alley smelled like ozone, sharp and metallic, the way the air smelled right after a storage battery overloaded. The blue light was gone now, but the space where it had been still seemed to shimmer faintly, like heat over pavement, though the night was cold. He heard voices. Low. Urgent. Not the flat, synthesized tones of the city's systems, but real voices, human voices, arguing in hushed, clipped tones about time and pursuit and a door closing. 8 figures in dark, hooded coats stood clustered around something Ethan's mind struggled to name. A rough, uneven tear in the air itself, edged in that same trembling blue light, like a wound that hadn't finished healing. One by one, the figures stepped through it and vanished, swallowed by whatever lay on the other side. Ethan should have turned around. Every instinct built into him by 27 years of scored, monitored, gently managed life screamed at him to turn around. He didn't. He walked into the alley, and when the last of the hooded figures ducked through the shimmering tear, Ethan Carter, cashier, 27 years old, owner of nothing, dreamer of dirt and open sky, followed them through. The world on the other side didn't announce itself the way he expected. There was no flash, no sense of falling. One moment he was standing in a rain-slicked alley beneath 100 stories of glass and steel. The next he was standing in silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure against his ears. He was underground. That much was obvious from the curved concrete overhead, ribbed like the inside of a great stone throat, but this wasn't any maintenance tunnel he recognized. Old rail lines ran along the floor, rusted and half-swallowed by moss. Trees, actual trees, their roots cracking up through broken pavement, grew in clusters wherever the light reached, fed by some source he couldn't identify. Strings of soft lantern light, not screens, not holograms, hung between makeshift structures built from salvaged metal and old signage. And above it all, through a long-forgotten skylight shaft choked with vines, he saw stars. Real stars. Not projected ones. Not the curated night sky simulation his apartment ceiling ran on cloudy evenings. Actual, distant, indifferent points of light that had been burning long before the network, long before the corporations, long before Ethan Carter had ever been scored, sorted, and filed away as harmless. He didn't realize he'd stopped walking until he heard the click of a weapon being armed somewhere close behind him. "Don't move," a woman's voice said, low and controlled, in a language that was still, unmistakably, human anger. "Hands where I can see them." He raised his hands slowly, heart slamming against his ribs. Ahead of him, the 8 hooded figures had turned as one, weapons, real weapons, not drone stunners, leveled at his chest. He'd knocked something over without noticing, some piece of salvaged metal debris that had rung out against the concrete like a bell, and in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Ethan understood, with total clarity, that he had made the second illegal decision of his life, and it was going to be considerably harder to survive than the first. "Who sent you?" It wasn't a question. The woman who'd spoken stepped forward, pulling back her hood. Ethan's breath caught, and not entirely from fear. She was. He didn't have a word ready for what she was. Humanoid, but not human, not quite. Vulpine features refined into something between animal and person, orange fur catching the lantern light in soft, burnished shades, sharp ears angled forward, alert. Her eyes were a pale, startling blue, fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel measured and found wanting in the space of half a second. A thin scar ran across the edge of one ear, old and pale. She wore a military uniform, patched and practical, insignia he didn't recognize stitched over one shoulder. She was, without any competition, the most striking person he had ever stood in front of. She was also, he understood belatedly, pointing a rifle at his chest. "Nobody sent me," Ethan said, hands still raised, voice cracking slightly. "I saw the light. In the alley? I don't even know what this place is." "Nobody follows Cell 7 through a transit rift by accident," said a man beside her, older, gray at the temples, his weapon steady. "I'm not lying," Ethan said. "I'm a cashier. I scan groceries. I don't even know what a transit rift is." The woman studied him a moment longer, blue eyes narrowing, and Ethan had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of being read like a document. Before she could respond, a low mechanical whine echoed from somewhere behind them. The unmistakable sound of a portal tearing open where no portal should be. A drone emerged through it, sleek and black, its scanner sweeping the chamber in one fast, clinical arc before locking onto the woman with a soft, decisive chime. "High priority target located," it announced, its voice a flat, pleasant contrast to the sudden tension in the room. "Confirmed identification, Commander Lyra, Cell 7. Deploying strike team." Everything happened at once. The rebels scattered into defensive positions with the practiced speed of people who had done this before, too many times, and knew exactly how little time a warning like that bought them. The woman, Lyra, the drone had called her, Commander Lyra, spun toward Ethan, rifle rising, her expression hardening into something colder than suspicion. "You let it here," she said. "I didn't. I don't even have a network implant that transmits location past the residential grid, I swear." "Convenient story. Lyra." The gray templed man stepped between them, hand raised, not touching her weapon but close enough to matter. "Look at him. Really look. He's shaking. He doesn't know how to hold his hands right for someone about to be executed. He's not trained. He's not a plant. He's just some worker who stumbled through a door he shouldn't have found." For a long, terrible second, Lyra's rifle didn't move. Then, with a sound like something breaking, one of the younger rebels raised a weapon of her own and put 3 rounds through the drone's optical sensor before it could finish transmitting its location lock. The machine spun once in the air and dropped, sparking, into the moss. "That won't matter," the gray templed man said grimly, already moving. "If it made contact before it died, they already have this position." Lyra lowered her rifle a fraction, though her eyes stayed on Ethan, cold and calculating. "Move!" she snapped to the others. "Full evac secondary site now." Around them, the underground world Ethan had marveled at moments before dissolved into disciplined chaos. Lanterns doused, crates hoisted, structures stripped bare with practiced efficiency. He stood frozen in the middle of it, understanding with sick clarity that whatever life he'd had that morning. The apartment, the register, the score blinking gently on his mirror, was already, irrevocably gone. "You," Lyra said, grabbing his arm hard enough to bruise. "You're not going back through that alley. Not now. Not ever." They moved fast through the ruins, deeper into the earth, Ethan half dragged along by a grip that didn't loosen no matter how many times he stumbled. Behind them, he heard the first distant thud of something heavy breaching the far end of the tunnel. Corporate strike teams, he assumed, though nobody stopped to explain, and he didn't have breath to ask. "Where are we going?" he managed. "Somewhere they don't have a lock on yet," Lyra said, not looking back. "Assuming that drone didn't finish its transmission. And if it did? Then we're already dead and just haven't noticed yet." It wasn't reassuring. It also, Ethan noticed with some distant, disconnected part of his mind, wasn't cruelty. Just the flat, economical honesty of someone who'd stopped having the energy to soften things. They emerged into a wider chamber, an old station platform, its curved ceiling still bearing the ghost of a route map from a transit system that had probably stopped running before Ethan's grandparents were born. Rebels poured through ahead of them, vanishing down a side passage, and Lyra finally released his arm to shove him toward it. Move! He moved. Behind them, the thudding grew louder, more rhythmic. Footsteps, many of them, heavy with equipment, closing the distance with the terrible patience of pursuers who knew exactly where their prey was funneled. They're going to catch us, Ethan said. Not if Weller does his job. Lyra didn't slow. Rensa! Charges! A voice further ahead confirmed it, and moments later a deep, muffled concussion rolled through the tunnel behind them, followed by the groan and crash of old concrete giving way. Dust boiled up the passage. The pursuing footsteps didn't stop, but they slowed, muffled now behind tons of rubble. That buys us minutes, the gray-templed man, Weller, apparently said, falling into step beside Lyra. Not more. Minutes are what we've got, Lyra said, and glanced back at Ethan with an expression he couldn't read at all. Keep up, cashier. You're not dying on my watch just to prove a point about how careful I usually am. They ran until running became walking, and walking became the slow, hollow-legged trudge of people who had spent every reserve of adrenaline they had. The tunnels opened eventually into something Ethan could only describe as a hidden town, a sprawl of salvaged shelters built into an old maintenance depot, lit by strings of scavenged bulbs and a scatter of real fires burning in metal drums, throwing warm, uneven light against curved concrete walls. People here didn't move like the ones in the city above. They didn't have that faint, permanent tension of being watched, scored, evaluated. Children, actual children, laughing, unscripted, chased each other between crates. An old woman stirred a pot over one of the fire drums and didn't once check a wrist display for a nutrition score. Ethan stood at the edge of it all, soaked and shaking and entirely unable to process what he was looking at. This is real, he said, mostly to himself. More real than anything you had up there, Weller said, not unkindly, passing him a rough wool blanket. Get warm. Commander will want to talk to you once she's done being furious. She seemed pretty furious the whole time I met her. Weller almost smiled. That's just Lyra on a good day. Ethan wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and sank down onto an overturned crate, watching the strange, firelit life of this hidden world move around him. Somewhere above, in towers he could no longer picture without a strange, sick vertigo, his apartment was probably already flagging his absence. His bank account was probably already frozen, pending review. His employer had probably already replaced his register with a kiosk before his shift would even have ended. He'd lost everything in the space of an hour. He looked up at the real, unfiltered stars through the shaft far above, and for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, the fear in his chest had started, very quietly, to make room for something that felt dangerously close to relief. This is the end of Act 1. They gave him a cot in a converted storage alcove and left him alone for 2 full days, which he later understood was less mercy than triage. Cell 7 had a compromised safe house to abandon, wounded to treat, and no particular reason to prioritize the stray cashier who'd wandered into their war. Lyra found him on the 3rd day, sitting at the edge of the fire drum circle, watching a boy of maybe 10 teach himself to whittle with a knife twice the length of his forearm. You're still here, she said, sitting across from him without asking permission, the way she seemed to do everything. Where would I go? I don't even know which direction the surface is. That's not what I meant. She studied the fire, not him, for once. You could have panicked. Tried to run. Most people who fall into this life do, eventually. You've just been sitting here. I've never had anywhere to run to, Ethan said, and was surprised by how easily the truth came out. Up there, I had an apartment I didn't own, a job a machine could do better, and a happiness score that never once told me anything I didn't already know. Down here, I don't have anything. But at least it's honest about it. Lyra's ears flicked, some small, unreadable motion. That's either very wise or very stupid. Probably both. For the first time since he'd met her, something like the ghost of a smile crossed her face before she caught it and put it away. Weller thinks you should be sent to the hollow settlements. Somewhere quiet, out of the fighting. What do you think? I think, Lyra said slowly, that you followed 8 armed strangers through an unstable rift without hesitating, and then you didn't run when a strike team came through a wall after you. That's not nothing. She stood, brushing dust from her uniform. Report to the armory at dawn. If you're staying, you're not staying useless. The armory was a converted rail car, its shelves lined with weapons that ranged from elegant to frankly terrifying, most of them older than Ethan, all of them lovingly maintained. Weller ran it with the brisk patience of a man who had trained 100 hopeless recruits before and had stopped expecting any of them to be naturals. Grip, he said, adjusting Ethan's hands on the rifle for the 3rd time. You're not trying to strangle it. Sorry. Don't apologize, adjust. Weller stepped back, arms crossed. You've genuinely never held a weapon before. There's never been a reason to. Crime rate's basically 0 up there. The network handles all of it before it happens. Convenient for a system that also happens to own every scrap of food and shelter on the continent. Weller's voice carried no real heat, just the tired cynicism of a man who'd said the same thing too many times to still feel angry saying it. Again. Sight down the barrel, don't close one eye like you're in some old film. They worked through the morning, weapons, then hand signals, then the layout of the settlement's escape routes, which Ethan was made to walk blindfolded until he stopped tripping over the same route twice. By midday his arms ached in ways they never had behind a register, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he didn't mind. Lyra observed the last hour of it from the doorway, arms folded, saying nothing until Weller finally called a stop. He's not hopeless, Weller reported, as if Ethan weren't standing 3 feet away. High praise, Lyra said dryly. For a first week? It is. Weller clapped Ethan on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him. Rest. Tomorrow we start on the part that actually matters, thinking fast when the shooting's real. Ethan caught Lyra's eyes across the car, and for a moment neither of them looked away. Rensa, the young rebel who'd destroyed the surveillance drone in the tunnels, turned out to be Cell 7's demolition specialist, a wiry, quick-tempered woman barely out of her teens who took an immediate and inexplicable liking to Ethan. You're the one who walked through a live rift because you saw a pretty light, she said, grinning, as she taught him to strip and rebuild a detonator over the following week. That's either the bravest thing I've ever heard or the dumbest. Lyra's already told me it's both. Lyra tells everyone everything's both. It's her whole personality. Rensa handed him the wiring harness. Again, and this time don't cross the leads, or you'll take my hand off along with your own. Over the following weeks, Ethan learned the settlement the way he'd once learned the Isles of Halden provisions, not all at once, but in accumulating layers, until the shape of it became second nature. He learned which tunnels flooded during the deep rains that occasionally found their way down through old drainage shafts. He learned which of the settlement's elders had been engineers before the corporations dissolved private ownership, and which had been soldiers, and which, like the old woman who cooked over the fire drum, had simply been mothers who'd refused to hand their children over to a system that scored infants before they could walk. He learned, too, why the underground world had no cameras, no AI, no network signal of any kind, not out of ideology alone, but because the moment any of Cell 7's technology touched the network, even peripherally, it became a beacon. Every safe house they'd ever lost, Weller told him grimly one night, had been lost that way, a careless charge left connected, a scavenged terminal not properly isolated, a single blinking light in the dark that had been enough. We don't fight the corporations with better weapons, Weller said. We fight them by disappearing. It's the only trick that's ever actually worked. 3 weeks in, Lyra took him on his first real supply run. A night mission to intercept an automated freight convoy hauling energy cores between 2 corporate distribution hubs, cores the settlement badly needed to keep its water purification systems running through the coming dry season. Stay behind me, Lyra said, checking her rifle in the dim light of the surface access tunnel. Do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. This isn't the armory. Nobody's going to stop and correct your grip. Understood. I mean it, Ethan, She looked at him directly, blue eyes sharp in the dark. People die on runs like this. Good people. I buried more of them than I can count anymore, and I am not adding a cashier to that list because he wanted to prove something. I'm not trying to prove anything. Then why are you here? He thought about it, really thought, instead of reaching for the easy answer. Because for the first time in my life, something I do actually matters to someone. Up there, I scanned groceries a machine could scan. Down here, if I mess this up, real people go thirsty. That's, I don't know. Terrifying. But it's real. Lyra held his gaze a moment longer than the conversation required, then turned back toward the tunnel exit. Stay close, she said again, softer this time. That's an order, not a request. The freight convoy came through exactly on schedule, 6 autonomous haulers gliding low over the abandoned service road in perfect silent formation, their cargo bays humming with the telltale charged signature of energy cores. Lyra's team moved like a single organism, Rence's charge disabling the convoy's rear sensor array, 2 others breaching the third hauler's cargo lock while Weller ran overwatch. Ethan's job was simple: carry. He carried, and he didn't freeze, and when it was over and the convoy resumed its route 3 cores lighter with no record of what had happened, Lyra allowed herself, just once, to look almost proud of him. The missions came more often after that, not because Ethan had proven himself entirely, but because Cell 7 was smaller than it used to be, and smaller cells needed every set of working hands they had. They hijacked a corporate AI convoy transporting behavioral prediction data between processing centers, a job that left Ethan's hands shaking for an hour afterward from adrenaline he hadn't known his body could produce. They destroyed a surveillance tower on the city's northern edge, watching from half a mile away as its scanner array collapsed into sparking wreckage, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar and fierce rise in his chest at the sight. Not triumph exactly, but its distant, exhausted cousin. They freed political prisoners from a transfer facility, 12 gaunt, hollow-eyed people who'd been detained for crimes as small as sharing unapproved literature, and Ethan carried a woman on his back for 4 miles because her legs had atrophied too badly in confinement to run on her own. She cried the entire way, not from pain, she told him later, but because she hadn't seen open sky in 3 years and had genuinely believed she never would again. Each mission cost something. A rebel named Torvin lost 2 fingers disarming a corporate security lock. A scout named Preem didn't come back at all from a reconnaissance run gone wrong, and Ethan watched Lyra sit alone by the fire drum that night, not crying, not talking, just staring into the flames with an exhaustion that looked older than she was. He sat beside her, not speaking, until she finally broke the silence herself. "You want to know the worst part?" she said. "I don't even remember what Preem's laugh sounded like anymore. I remember his file. His skill rating. His last mission report. I've turned him into a document in my head because it's the only way I can keep functioning after losing him." She looked at Ethan, eyes bright and furious and grieving all at once. "That's what this war does to you. It doesn't just take people. It takes the parts of you that knew how to miss them properly." The assassination of Director Holcomb Reyes. The corporate executive personally responsible for the population tracking division that had turned every citizen's future into a predictive dataset, was, by every account, the most dangerous operation Cell 7 had attempted in 2 years. Planning took a month. Lyra ran the briefings herself, a projected schematic of Reyes's tower floating above a salvage table, pieced together from stolen blueprints and 3 separate infiltration attempts that had cost 2 operatives their lives before Ethan had even arrived. "He doesn't leave the tower," Lyra explained, tracing a finger along the projected security perimeter. "Hasn't in 4 years. Every entrance is biometric locked, every hallway is monitored by systems that make our old surveillance towers look like children's toys. The only opening we have is here." She tapped a service corridor. "During the weekly maintenance window, 90 seconds before the backup systems reboot." 90 seconds. Rensa repeated. "To get in, get to him, and get out." 90 seconds to get in. Lyra corrected. We're not getting out the same way. The room went quiet at that. I'll go, Ethan said before he'd fully decided to say it. Every head turned toward him. Lyra's expression, for once, was unreadable in a way that felt less like calculation and more like something closer to fear. No, she said flatly. Lyra! I said no. She turned back to the schematic, her voice tight. You've been with us 4 months. You're not ready for a one-way infiltration. Then send someone who is, and let me cover the corridor, Ethan said. I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm trying to help the people who pulled a stranger out of a rift instead of shooting him for wandering into their war. The silence stretched. Finally, Weller spoke, quiet and measured. He's not wrong that we're short on hands, Commander. Lyra didn't answer for a long moment. When she finally did, her voice was low enough that only Ethan, standing closest, fully heard it. If anything happens to you on that corridor, I will never forgive myself. Do you understand that? The operation went as close to plan as anything in a war ever did, which was to say, not entirely. Ethan held the maintenance corridor exactly as briefed, covering 2 operatives, Rensa and a grim, silent veteran named Cade, as they slipped through the 90-second window into Reyes's private tower. He counted the seconds in his head the way Weller had drilled into him, weapons steady despite the sweat running down his spine, every distant footstep in the tower's lower levels sending his pulse spiking. At second 61, an unscheduled security patrol rounded the corridor's far end. Ethan didn't think. He'd learned, over 4 months, that thinking too hard in these moments got people killed. He stepped into the open, raised empty hands, and said, in the flattest, most bored voice he could manage, "Maintenance overrides, Sector 9, I've got a coolant leak reported on this level." The patrol drone paused, running the claim against its database, a database that, thanks to a data spike Rensa had planted a week earlier, briefly, falsely, confirmed exactly that. It moved on. Ethan didn't breathe again until it was gone. Inside the tower, Rensa and Cade reached Reyes's private office with 11 seconds to spare. What happened in that room, Ethan never asked to know in detail, and neither of them ever offered it freely. Only that Cade didn't make it out, that the alarm triggered 4 seconds after they triggered their exit charge, and that Rensa emerged from the collapsing service corridor with blood that wasn't hers soaked through her sleeve and a look in her eyes that took weeks to fade. Reyes was dead. The Population Tracking Division's central architect gone. It should have felt like victory. It felt, mostly, like another name added to the fire drum silence. Lyra found Ethan afterward, in the tunnel outside the settlement, and instead of speaking, she simply put her arms around him and held on, hard, for a long moment, as if checking with her own hands that he was actually still there. "Don't ever do that again," she said finally into his shoulder. "I didn't do the dangerous part. You stood alone in a hostile tower and lied to a security drone with your whole life on the line. Don't tell me that wasn't dangerous." She pulled back, blue eyes wet in the dim light. "I can't lose you too, Ethan. I don't have room left for that." It was Rensa, 3 weeks after Reyes's death, who found the thread that unraveled everything. She'd spent the intervening time picking through the data spikes she'd planted in his tower's systems before the mission. A routine harvest, meant to grab whatever administrative files it could before the connection burned, and what she found, buried 6 layers deep in an archive nobody had thought to properly secure, wasn't administrative at all. "You need to see this," she told Lyra, voice tight in a way Ethan had never heard from her. "All of you need to see this." They gathered in the settlement's makeshift command car, Rensa's salvage terminal propped on a crate, its screen throwing pale light across faces that were already, somehow, bracing for bad news. "Reyes's division wasn't just tracking people," Rensa said. "Purchases, movement, conversation logs, all of that, that's the part everyone already knew about. This is deeper. This is predictive." She pulled up a cascading series of models, projections, probability trees that stretched years into the future for names Ethan didn't recognize. The network isn't just watching what people do. It's calculating what they're statistically going to do. Relationships. Careers. Whether they'll have kids, and how many, and whether those kids will grow up to cause problems. It runs the numbers on everyone. That's... Weller's voice was hoarse. That's not surveillance. That's fate, run by an algorithm. It gets worse, Rensa said quietly. Anyone whose probability model flags them as a future rebellion risk gets flagged for what the file calls preemptive resolution. They don't get arrested. They don't get warnings. They just disappear. Quietly. Written off as relocations, or voluntary disconnections, or accidents. Thousands of them. Maybe more. The car went silent. How does anyone slip through that? Ethan finally asked. How did I? I walked through a rift, joined a terrorist cell, and I'm apparently still breathing. Rensa scrolled further, found what she was looking for, and turned the screen toward him. A file. His file. His entire life, quantified right down to a single line near the bottom. Psychological profile, passive compliant. Rebellion probability, negligible. Classification, harmless. You were never a threat, according to the model, she said. That's the only reason you're alive. That night, Ethan found Lyra alone on the old station platform, sitting on the edge where the tracks used to run, legs dangling over a drop that led nowhere anymore. He sat beside her without asking, the way she'd taught him, and for a while neither of them said anything. Harmless, she said eventually, not quite a question. Apparently. You don't seem harmless to me. I scan groceries for a living, Lyra. My biggest act of defiance before that alley was occasionally taking an extra 4 minutes on my lunch break. He looked out at the dark. The system was right about me. I was exactly what it thought I was. Until I wasn't. That's the part that scares me. Lyra admitted, quiet in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. If it can be that wrong about you, if its whole architecture rests on sorting billions of people into boxes and it just missed this. She gestured vaguely at him, at the war, at everything he'd become since that rainy night. Then how many others has it gotten wrong the other direction? How many people has it erased who never would have actually done anything, just because a model said they might? I don't know. Neither do I. She drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them, and for a moment she looked less like Commander Lyra of Cell 7 and more like a woman who had simply been fighting for far too long. I was 17 when I lost my first cell. Real cell, before this one, before I had rank enough to call anything mine. 11 of us. Corporate strike team took the safe house in under 6 minutes. I was the only one who got out, because I was fast and small and terrified enough to run instead of fight. She wasn't looking at him now. I never expected to survive this long, Ethan. Not really. You'd get used to counting your life in operations instead of years. You survived tonight, Ethan said. You're surviving right now. I know. She finally looked at him, and something in her face had cracked open, unguarded, exhausted, real. I just don't know what to do with hope anymore. I forgot how to hold it without expecting it to be taken. Then let me hold some of it for you, Ethan said before he could think better of it. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that seemed to be searching for the catch, the trick, the eventual cost, because in her experience, he understood now, there always was one. When she didn't find it, something in her shoulders finally, visibly eased. That's a dangerous thing to offer a person like me, she said, but there was no edge in it anymore. I've done a lot of dangerous things lately. A real laugh escaped her then, short and surprised, like it had gotten loose before she could stop it. You have, cashier. You really have. She leaned back on her hands, looking up at the ragged circle of real stars visible through the shaft above them. 4 months ago I nearly executed you in a tunnel. I remember. I'm glad Weller stopped me. Me too. Executed feels like it would have really put a damper on this conversation. She laughed again, and this time she let it linger, let herself lean, just slightly, until her shoulder rested against his. Neither of them moved to correct the distance. The settlement hummed quietly around them, a child's laugh somewhere, the clink of someone repairing a generator, the ever-present low murmur of a community that had built something real out of ruins. And for a little while, Ethan let himself simply exist in it, without calculating what came next. "I don't know how to do this," Lyra admitted eventually. "Whatever this is. I've spent so long making sure I don't need anyone specifically, so it hurts less when they're gone." "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan said. "Everyone says that." "I mean it. I know you do." She turned her head close enough now that he could see every fleck of pale blue in her eyes, the scar along her ear silvered faintly in the low light. "That's what terrifies me most about you." Either of them closed the distance that night. But something had shifted, quietly and irreversibly, in the space between them, and both of them knew it. Word came 3 days later that shattered whatever fragile calm had settled over the settlement. Corporate forces had located and razed the hollow settlements, the quiet, out-of-the-way communities where non-combatants and children had been relocated for safety. Lyra took the news standing perfectly still, her jaw tight, and then she turned and walked directly into the command car without a word to anyone, and didn't emerge for 6 hours. Ethan found her there afterward, staring at a projected map gone half-empty with markers for settlements that no longer existed. "How many?" he asked quietly. "We don't know yet. Communications down across the whole Western network of cells." Her voice was flat, controlled in the specific way that meant it was the only thing holding something much larger back. Weller had family there. A sister. Her kids. "Lyra! I keep thinking about the file," she said, cutting him off, not unkindly, just unable to stop the thought once it had started. Rence's file. The prediction models. What if it wasn't preemptive resolution this time? What if it was just cleanup? What if we made ourselves enough of a threat with Reyes that they decided the non-combatants weren't worth tracking individually anymore, and it was just easier to remove the whole category? You don't know that. I don't know anything anymore, Ethan, that's the problem. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment, and when she lowered them, the composure had come back, thinner than before but present. "I have to tell Weller. I have to tell the whole settlement. And then I have to figure out how we keep fighting a system that apparently doesn't even need a reason to erase people anymore. You don't have to do all of that alone." "I know." She met his eyes, something raw and grateful passing behind the exhaustion. "Stay close tonight. Please. I don't think I can hold the rest of this up without something steady nearby." He stayed. He didn't say much, there wasn't much that could be said, but he stayed, all night, while the settlement grieved in the particular silence of people who had learned, over and over, exactly how much a war like this one could cost. Grief, in the settlement, had never been a private thing. Within a day of the news, the fire drums burned longer into the night, and people gathered around them not to plan, not yet, but simply to be near each other, to say names out loud so they wouldn't be lost entirely to files and probability trees. Weller stood at the center of it on the second night, his composure worn thin but intact, and told stories about his sister, small, ordinary stories, the kind that mattered more for their smallness. How she'd hated mornings. How she used to sing badly on purpose to make her kids laugh. How she'd once told him that even in a world where nothing belonged to anyone, she still felt like the sky was hers, at least, because nobody had figured out how to subscription lock the stars yet. Ethan listened from the edge of the circle, Lyra beside him, her hand finding his in the dark without either of them commenting on it. "She sounds like she would have liked you," Lyra murmured, watching Weller. "She always said the cell needed someone who hadn't already had the hope beaten out of them. Is that what I am? The hope mascot? Don't ruin it," Lyra said, but there was warmth in it now, fragile but real, the kind that could survive even a night like this one. "You're the first new person in years who made this place feel less like a countdown and more like a beginning. That matters more than you know." They sat together long after the stories quieted, after most of the settlement had drifted back to their shelters, watching the fire drums burn low. At some point, Lyra's head came to rest against his shoulder, and Ethan didn't move, didn't speak, just let the weight of her settle there, an unspoken kind of trust that felt, in its own quiet way, larger than any mission they'd run together. "Thank you," she said eventually, so softly he almost missed it. "For not needing me to be strong every single second. You don't have to be. Not with me." She lifted her head just enough to look at him, firelight catching the damp shine still in her eyes, and for the second time, either of them moved away. The weeks that followed brought no peace, only a grim, determined momentum. Cell 7 absorbed survivors from the shattered Hollow network. 31 people, including 4 children who had lost every adult who'd once been responsible for them, and the settlement stretched itself thin to accommodate the sudden influx, tunnels repurposed, rations rebalanced, watch rotations doubled. Ethan found himself, without quite deciding to, becoming something like a steady presence for the newly arrived children, the way he'd once been a steady, reassuring face behind a register that barely needed him. He didn't have Weller's tactical mind or Rence's technical skill, but he had patience, and an easy way of crouching down to a child's eye level and asking what they were building with scavenged scrap instead of what they'd lost. Lyra watched this happen over several evenings without comment, until one night she simply sat beside him while he helped a girl no older than 7 balance a lopsided tower of salvaged bolts. "You're good with them," she said. "I like that they don't ask me to justify why I'm here. Neither do I anymore." She watched the girl's tower wobble and hold. "I used to think I'd never want children. Not in this life. Not with the odds the way they are." Her voice was careful, testing the shape of the thought as she said it. "Lately I'm not so sure that's still true." Ethan didn't answer right away, letting the moment breathe instead of rushing to fill it. "That's not a small thing to say out loud." "No," Lyra agreed. "It isn't." She reached over, steadying the girl's tower before it could fully collapse, her hand brushing Ethan's in the process, and neither of them pulled away. "I used to think surviving was the only thing worth planning for. You've made me start wondering if there's more to want than that." The girl's tower finally toppled, scattering bolts across the floor with a delighted shriek of laughter, and both of them laughed too, quiet and unguarded, the sound of it feeling, for just a moment, like something the war hadn't managed to take yet. The mission to hijack a corporate data center went wrong within the first 4 minutes, and it was Ethan, not Lyra, who kept it from becoming a slaughter. The plan had been simple on paper. Breach the outer relay station, plant Rence's harvesting node, extract before the internal security cycle refreshed. What the plan hadn't accounted for was a manual security override, human, not automated, a night shift technician who triggered a silent alarm the moment he spotted movement on a camera Rence's scans had somehow missed. By the time the strike team arrived, Cell 7 was pinned in a service stairwell 3 floors below the data core, exit routes collapsing one by one as reinforcements sealed the building section by section. "We're not getting out through the relay station," Weller reported grimly, blood running from a graze along his temple. "They've sealed it. There has to be another way," Lyra said, scanning the schematic on her wrist display, jaw tight. Ethan, crouched beside a maintenance panel he'd been idly studying while the others argued, spoke up. "There's a coolant vent here. Runs down to the sub-basement, connects to the old storm drainage system. It's not on the security grid because it predates the building's current systems entirely." Lyra looked at him sharply. "How do you know that? Halden Provisions used the same drainage retrofit 20 years ago. I spent 3 years stocking shelves next to a maintenance closet with the same blueprint stamped on the access panel." He shrugged, adrenaline making the gesture jerkier than he intended. Being an ordinary cashier is apparently good for something. It worked. Barely. They squeezed through a vent never designed for 4 adults and a data node, dropped into freezing storm water up to their waists, and emerged 3 blocks away, soaked and shaking and, against every reasonable expectation, entirely alive. Lyra didn't say anything until they were safely back in the tunnels, and then she pulled him aside, gripping the front of his jacket with both hands, not in anger this time. "You saved all of us," she said. "Do you understand that? Not just yourself. All of us. I got lucky." "No," she said, fierce and certain. "You paid attention. That's not luck. That's exactly the kind of thing I fell for." The words hung between them, unretractable, and for the first time, either of them tried to take them back. "That's exactly the kind of thing I fell for." Neither of them moved for a long moment, the words settling into the space between them like something too fragile to touch carelessly. Around them, the tunnel dripped with runoff, distant and forgotten, the rest of the team already moving ahead toward dry clothes and warmth, giving them, without quite meaning to, a moment alone. "Say that again," Ethan said quietly. "So I know I didn't imagine it." "I fell for you," Lyra said, steadier this time, though her hands hadn't yet let go of his jacket. "Somewhere between the tunnel where I almost shot you and the storm drain where you just saved my entire team, I fell for you, and I don't know when it happened, and I'm terrified of what it means to want something this much in a life like mine. I've wanted to tell you the same thing for weeks," Ethan admitted. "I just didn't know how, without it sounding like I was trying to steal comfort from someone who's already carrying too much." "You're not stealing anything." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. "You're the first thing in years I've wanted to hold on to instead of brace for losing." He reached up, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face, and she leaned into the touch instead of away from it, eyes closing for just a moment, as if allowing herself, finally, to simply feel something without calculating its cost. "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan said again, the same promise as before, but it landed differently this time, no longer a comfort offered to a grieving commander but a vow spoken between two people who had chosen each other, deliberately, in the middle of a war that gave them every reason not to. "Don't promise me that," Lyra said softly. "Just stay for as long as you can. That's enough. Then I'll stay for as long as I can, and I'll fight like hell to make that as long as possible." She finally let go of his jacket, only to slide her arms around him instead, and this time, when their faces drew close in the dim tunnel light, either of them hesitated. The kiss was brief, careful, the tentative kind that comes after too much fear has been spent to trust anything easily, but it was real, and it was theirs, and for a moment the war outside the tunnel simply ceased to exist. They didn't speak of it openly for a while, not out of shame, but because the settlement had enough grief to carry without needing to also process its commander's private heart, though Rensa, predictably, noticed within days, and took to grinning at Ethan across the fire drum in a way that made his ears burn. It was 3 weeks later, after a mission that had gone as close to flawless as any Operation Cell 7 had run in months, a supply cache recovered intact, no casualties, no pursuit, that Lyra came to him that night, in the quiet hour after the settlement had mostly gone to sleep, and didn't pretend the visit was about anything else. "I keep almost losing you," she said, standing in the doorway of the storage alcove that had become, gradually and without either of them fully deciding it, more his space than a temporary cot. "Every mission. Every time a strike team gets close. I keep rehearsing in my head what I'll do if it finally happens. And I'm so tired of rehearsing grief instead of just letting myself have this." "Then don't rehearse it," Ethan said, standing to meet her. "Not tonight." She crossed the small space between them, and this time there was no hesitation in either of them, no fear holding the moment at arm's length. What passed between them that night was gentle where the war outside was not. Unhurried, honest, full of the kind of quiet tenderness that neither of them had been permitted, for years, to believe they still deserved. It wasn't about anything explicit or performed. It was about two exhausted, frightened people finally allowing themselves to be fully known by someone else, scars and grief and stubborn hope included, and finding that the other person stayed anyway. Afterward, in the dark, Lyra's head resting against his chest, she said, so quietly he almost missed it, "I haven't felt this safe since I was 17. "You're safe now," Ethan said, and meant it as fully as he had ever meant anything. Nobody's ever safe in this life, she murmured, but there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of peace. But I believe, for tonight, that I am. That's more than I've had in a long time. They fell asleep tangled together, the settlement quiet around them, the war waiting, as it always did, for morning. Morning came, as it always did, with news that ended the fragile calm. A scout burst into the command car before dawn, breathless, having run the final stretch of tunnel at a full sprint. "Corporate recon drones," she gasped. 3 sweeps in the last 2 hours, converging pattern, getting tighter each time. They're narrowing in on this sector. Lyra was on her feet immediately, the softness of the night before folding back into the hard, controlled focus of a commander with a settlement to protect. "How long?" "Hours, maybe. Not more. Full evacuation protocol," Lyra said, already moving. "Weller, get the non-combatants moving toward the secondary depot. Rensa, I want every trace of our presence scrubbed from this sector before we're gone, nothing left for a strike team to analyze." She turned to Ethan, and for just a moment the commander's mask cracked, just enough to show the fear underneath. "We knew this was coming eventually. I just hoped we'd have more time." "We'll get everyone out," Ethan said. "We'll try." She caught his hand briefly, a small, private gesture amid the mounting chaos. "Whatever happens today, last night was real. I need you to know that, no matter what comes next." "Don't talk like this is goodbye." "I'm not," Lyra said, though her eyes said she was at least preparing for the possibility. "I'm talking like someone who's learned not to leave things unsaid. That's all." The settlement moved with the practiced, grim efficiency of people who had done this before, packing what could be carried, torching what couldn't be moved and shouldn't be found, children shepherded through back tunnels by adults who kept their own fear carefully hidden. Ethan worked alongside them, carrying crates, guiding the youngest children by the hand, doing the small, unglamorous work that kept a community alive during its worst hours. By the time the corporate strike force breached the settlement's outer perimeter, Cell 7's people were already 3 tunnels away, and all the strike team found waiting for them was ash, empty shelters, and silence. It wouldn't be enough. Not for long. But it was, for now, survival. The main headquarters of the wider rebellion network, the deep, ancient bunker complex that Cell 7's settlement had always considered its final fallback, the place other cells reported to when their own safe houses failed, had been a rumor to Ethan for most of his time underground, spoken of only in hushed, reverent tones by veterans who'd been there once, years ago, and never expected to need it again. They needed it now. The journey took 4 days, moving in small, scattered groups to avoid presenting a single trackable signature, funneling gradually toward a location so deep beneath the old city that even the sound of surface traffic couldn't reach it. When Ethan finally saw it, a vast, cathedral-like cavern strung with generations of salvage technology, home to hundreds of rebels from a dozen different cells, he understood, for the first time, the true scale of what he'd stumbled into that rainy night. "This is everyone?" he asked Lyra, taking in the scope of it. "This is what's left of everyone," she corrected quietly. 20 years ago, this cavern held 3 times as many people. The network's gotten better at finding us. We've gotten better at surviving, but the math isn't in our favor anymore." Weller found them shortly after arrival, his face grim in a way that made Ethan's stomach tighten before he'd even spoken. "Central Commands had the Reyes data verified across every cell that's checked in. The predictive resolution program isn't slowing down. If anything, our operations have accelerated it. The corporations are treating open resistance as statistical proof their model's threat categories were too conservative. They're expanding the erasure lists. So fighting harder made it worse," Ethan said. "Fighting harder made them scared," Lyra said. "Scared organizations don't behave rationally. They behave defensively, and defensively, right now, means erasing anyone who might become a problem before they can prove it." She looked out over the cavern, at hundreds of people who had given up everything to be here. "We have one option left that isn't slow extinction. We stopped trying to win a war of attrition we were always going to lose, and we make sure the truth outlives whatever they do to us next. The plan that emerged over the following days was audacious in a way that made even hardened veterans go quiet when Lyra first outlined it. "Every screen," she said, standing before the assembled leadership of a dozen cells, the cavern lit by strings of salvaged lanterns and the pale glow of a dozen jury-rigged terminals. "Every phone, every billboard, every AI assistant connected to the network, all at once, for as long as we can hold the breach open. Reyes's data. The erasure files. The real footage from the hollow settlements. Everything they've buried, broadcast simultaneously to every citizen who's ever been told the system exists for their freedom. That requires breaching the network's central relay hub." A representative from another cell said slowly. "Nobody's gotten within a mile of that facility and lived to report back." "I know," Lyra said. "Which is why it has to be now, while we still have enough people and enough desperation to actually attempt it, instead of waiting until we're too small to try anything at all." Ethan watched her lay out the plan with the same clear, controlled focus he'd first seen in the tunnel where she'd nearly executed him, except now, months later, he understood what lay beneath that control. Not coldness, but a woman who had learned, through years of loss, that hesitation killed more people than boldness ever had. The plan required almost everything Cell 7 and its allied cells had left. Rensa would breach the relay hub's outer defenses with charges she'd been quietly stockpiling for exactly this kind of desperate gambit. Weller would lead a diversionary strike on the tower's ground-level security to draw strike teams away from the primary breach point. Lyra would lead the infiltration team into the hub itself, to physically interface with the broadcast override, a system that, by design, couldn't be triggered remotely, precisely because the corporations had never imagined anyone would be willing to get close enough to try. "I want to lead the diversion," Ethan said, when the briefing broke and he found Lyra alone, studying the tower schematic one final time. "No, Lyra! I need you on the extraction team," she said, not looking up. "Not because I don't trust you in a fight. Because if this goes wrong, I need someone who can get people out who still remembers how to think when everything's falling apart. That's what you are, Ethan. You've always been the one who finds the coolant vent nobody else notices." The night before the operation, the cavern fell into a hush unlike anything Ethan had experienced since arriving underground. Hundreds of people writing letters that might never be delivered, holding children a little longer than usual, checking weapons that had already been checked twice. Lyra found him near the cavern's edge, where a thin crack in the ceiling let through a sliver of the world above, not stars this time, just the faint, distant glow of the city that had once been his entire universe. "Scared?" she asked, settling beside him. "Terrified," Ethan admitted. "You? Always." She leaned into him, and he wrapped an arm around her, the two of them quiet for a while, listening to the distant hum of a settlement preparing for the fight of its life. "I keep thinking about what you said, that first week. About wanting land. Somewhere to disconnect. Grow something. Just exist without being scored for it. Feels like a lifetime ago. It wasn't, though. It was less than a year." She turned to look at him, eyes catching the faint light from the crack above. "If we survive this, and I mean actually survive, not just live to fight the next operation, I want that with you. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere real. I want to know what it's like to plan a future instead of just planning the next mission. That's the first time I've heard you talk about after," Ethan said softly. "I know." She smiled, small and a little disbelieving of her own hope. "You did that. You made me believe there might actually be an after worth planning for." "Then let's survive tomorrow," Ethan said, pulling her closer. "And figure out the rest together." "Together," she agreed, and for a while longer they simply sat in the near dark, two people who had found something worth protecting in the middle of a war that had taken almost everything else from both of them, gathering whatever strength that gave them for the fight that was coming with the dawn. The assault on the network's central relay hub began at dawn, timed to a maintenance cycle Rensa had spent 3 sleepless nights confirming down to the second. Weller's diversionary force hit the tower's ground-level security first, a controlled, violent chaos of gunfire and shattered checkpoints that drew strike teams pouring toward the lobby exactly as planned. Ethan watched it unfold from a rooftop 2 blocks away, coordinating the extraction team's positioning through a salvaged comm unit, his stomach in knots every time Weller's voice crackled through with another update, each one a little more strained than the last. "Diversion's holding," Weller reported, breathless over gunfire. "But they're pulling reserves faster than we expected. Lyra, you need to move now, while the upper floors are still thin." "Copy." Lyra's voice came back, tight with focus. "Rensa, charges are set. On my mark." The explosion that tore open the relay hub's service entrance was visible even from Ethan's rooftop vantage, a brief, violent bloom of light and smoke against the tower's otherwise pristine face. Lyra's infiltration team vanished into the breach seconds later, and from that point on, Ethan had nothing to do but wait, monitor, and trust. 3 things that had never come easily to him, and came even less easily now that the person he loved was somewhere inside a tower designed specifically to kill people like her. Minutes stretched unbearably. Weller's diversion began to falter as reinforcements arrived in numbers the original plan hadn't accounted for. Ethan heard the fear creeping into the older man's voice, heard the gunfire grow closer to his position instead of farther away. "Ethan," Weller's voice came through, ragged. "We can't hold the lobby much longer. If Lyra's team doesn't reach the override soon, we're going to lose the diversion entirely, and every strike team in the building's going to converge on her position instead. How long can you hold?" "Not long enough." Ethan made his decision in the space of a single breath, the same way he made the decision to open a locked car door on a rainy night, months and a lifetime ago. "Then I'm not staying on this roof." He reached the lobby's edge in time to see Weller's diversionary force collapsing under the weight of reinforcements, 3 rebels down, the rest pinned behind overturned barricades with dwindling ammunition and no clear path to retreat. "You're supposed to be running extraction," Weller shouted over the gunfire as Ethan dropped in beside him. "Extraction's not going to matter if there's nobody left to extract." Ethan shot back, already scanning the lobby for anything useful. And there, half hidden behind a decorative planter that had somehow survived the chaos, he spotted it, a maintenance panel, the twin of 100 others he'd learned to read like a second language over months underground. "That leads to the tower's secondary coolant system," he said, already moving toward it. "It'll flood this level with enough vapor to blind their optical scanners for at least a minute. Long enough to fall back to a defensible position." "You're sure?" "No," Ethan admitted, already prying the panel loose. "But it's better than the plan we've currently got, which is dying here." The coolant vapor, when it came, rolled through the lobby in a thick, disorienting fog that turned the strike team's optical targeting systems useless within seconds. Weller's people used the cover to fall back through a side corridor, dragging their wounded with them, buying precious minutes that Ethan hoped, desperately, would be enough for Lyra's team to finish what they'd come to do. His comm crackled. Lyra's voice, strained but alive. "Override's active. Broadcast is live in 60 seconds. We need everyone clear of the tower before then. They'll flood this whole level with security response the second the signal goes out." "We're pinned in the lobby," Ethan reported. "Weller's wounded are slowing us down." "Then get them moving, Ethan. I'm not losing anyone else today." A pause, tight with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope. "I'm coming down. Don't you dare be gone when I get there." She never made it down. Ethan heard it happen over the comm before he saw any of it. A burst of gunfire far closer to Lyra's position than it should have been, her voice cutting off mid-sentence, replaced by an unfamiliar, clipped corporate security channel that had somehow bled onto their frequency. "Target secured. Commander designation confirmed. Transport to Tower 9 for processing." "Lyra!" Ethan's voice cracked over the comm, useless, unanswered. Weller's hand closed hard on his shoulder before he could do something reckless. "The broadcast," Weller said, voice rough with his own barely contained panic. It went out. I can see it. Every screen in the lobby's playing it right now. Ethan looked up, and for a moment, even with Lyra's capture ringing in his ears like a physical blow, he couldn't look away from what filled every screen in the lobby. The erasure files, the hollow settlement footage, faces of people the network had quietly deleted from existence, scrolling past in raw, unedited horror, broadcasting to every citizen, every household, every subscriber across the entire city. The truth, finally, undeniably loose in the world. It didn't matter. Not in that moment. Not with Lyra gone. We have to get to Tower 9, Ethan said. Ethan, that's the corporate executive processing center. It's the most secure building on the continent. I don't care. His voice was steadier than he felt, some cold, focused clarity settling over the panic, the same clarity that had once let him lie flatly to a security drone with his life on the line. She went into that tower for all of us. I am not leaving her to whatever they do to commanders they capture. Weller studied him for a long moment, something like grim respect passing over his exhausted face. Then we're not leaving her either, he said, and began shouting orders to whatever remained of the diversion team, rallying the wounded, the exhausted, the barely standing survivors of a battle that had already cost them more than any of them wanted to count, for one more impossible push. Tower 9 rose at the heart of the corporate district, a black glass spire that Ethan had passed 100 times in his old life without ever knowing what happened inside it. The place, he understood now, where the corporations processed their highest value captures, where public executions of rebellion leadership were streamed as deterrents to citizens who dared to question the system too loudly. They had hours, maybe less. Executions of high-profile captures, Rensa's frantic research confirmed, were rarely delayed. The corporations preferred to make examples quickly, before public sympathy or rescue attempts could organize. The infiltration was reckless in a way that would have gotten Ethan killed a year ago, back when he still thought carefully before every action instead of trusting the strange, hard-won instincts he'd built over months underground. They used the chaos of the broadcast's aftermath, citizens spilling into streets in confused, angry crowds, security forces stretched thin trying to contain public reaction, to slip past checkpoints that would have been impossible under normal conditions. Rensa cut through Tower 9's exterior security with the same cool precision she'd once used to disable a hostile drone in a tunnel full of strangers. Weller led what remained of their fighting force through the ground floor, drawing what little resistance remained after the broadcast had thrown the entire security apparatus into disarray. Ethan went for the execution level alone. He found Lyra in a holding chamber 3 floors from the top, secured to a restraint frame that looked, with sickening clarity, exactly like the kind of apparatus meant for a public spectacle. Her uniform was torn, a bruise blooming along her jaw, but her eyes, when they found his through the chamber's reinforced glass, were sharp and alive and furious. "You absolute idiot," she said, when he finally breached the lock and got the door open. "You brought a broadcast crisis and a rescue mission into the same building." "I brought myself into the same building," Ethan corrected, already working at her restraints with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "The broadcast just made it easier. They're going to flood this level with response teams any second. Then let's not be here when they do." The restraints gave way just as the chamber's alarm finally caught up with reality, a piercing klaxon that echoed through Tower 9's upper levels, followed almost immediately by the heavy, synchronized footfalls of a response team converging on their position. "Portal generator," Lyra gasped, pulling free and stumbling against him, still weak from whatever they'd done to her during questioning. "Rensa's carrying a portable unit, salvaged from the original rift we came through, all those months ago. It's our fastest way out if we can reach the extraction point before they seal the level. Then we run," Ethan said, wrapping an arm around her to keep her upright, and they ran. The corridor to the extraction point felt endless, alarms shrieking overhead, security drones converging from side passages faster than Ethan could track. Weller's voice crackled over the comm, strained with his own fight 2 floors below. "Extraction points compromised. We're falling back to the secondary site, east stairwell, Moving now. They changed course mid-stride, cutting through a service corridor that Ethan navigated on pure instinct, the same instinct that had once found a coolant vent in a building he'd never seen blueprints for. Behind them, the response team's footsteps grew louder, closer, and Lyra, despite her exhaustion, kept pace with a grim, determined will that refused to slow. They found Rensa and the remains of the extraction team at the east stairwell, the portable rift generator already humming to life, its unstable blue light casting long, flickering shadows across the corridor. Rensa's hands moved over the controls with practiced urgency, sweat running down her face. "It's not stable," she warned, as the first response team rounded the corridor behind them, weapons raised. "This wasn't built for a clean jump, it's built for a desperate one." "Then let's be desperate," Lyra said, and together, with gunfire erupting behind them and the tower's alarms shrieking overhead, Cell 7's survivors plunged through the collapsing, unstable light of a rift that hadn't been designed to hold, back toward whatever remained of the world they'd fought to save. They emerged in the deep tunnels below the city, the rift collapsing behind them in a violent flash that sealed the passage entirely, and for a long, ragged moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, all of them simply breathing in the astonishment of having survived something that, by every reasonable calculation, should have killed most of them. Lyra was the first to break the silence, sinking to her knees against the tunnel wall, exhaustion and relief and grief finally catching up to her all at once. "We lost people," she said quietly, doing the terrible math that every commander eventually had to do. "Torvin. 2 of the scouts from the eastern cell. We lost people," Weller agreed, settling heavily beside her, his own wounds finally getting the attention they needed for hours. "But the broadcast held for almost 4 minutes before they cut the signal." "4 minutes, Lyra. Across the entire city. Is that enough?" Ethan asked, still holding Lyra close, unwilling to let more distance than necessary come between them after everything. Nobody had an answer, not yet. It would take days for the scattered reports to filter back through what remained of the rebellion's communication network. Accounts of citizens standing frozen before public screens, refusing to move, refusing to look away, even as security forces tried to disperse them. Accounts of AI assistants across the city receiving a strange, unprecedented spike in the single command, "Disconnect me." Accounts, slowly, cautiously, of small pockets of resistance forming in districts that had never shown any sign of dissent before, ordinary citizens who had simply, finally, seen something they couldn't unsee. It wasn't victory. Cell 7's people understood that with the particular clarity of those who had spent years learning not to mistake small gains for the whole war. The corporations still ruled the towers above. The network still watched, still scored, still predicted. But something had shifted, quietly and irreversibly, in the minds of people who had, for exactly 60 seconds, glimpsed the truth their entire lives had been built to hide from them. "We lost the battle," Lyra said finally, looking up at Ethan, exhaustion and something that might, cautiously, have been hope written across her face. "But I don't think we lost the war. Not entirely. Not anymore." The weeks that followed were quieter than any Ethan had known since stepping through that alley rift, not because the danger had passed. The corporations, humiliated and furious, redoubled their surveillance efforts across every remaining settlement. But because Cell 7, battered and diminished, finally allowed itself something it had denied itself for years, the deliberate, unhurried work of healing. They mourned the dead properly this time, not just around a fire drum but with real ceremony, names spoken aloud one by one, the settlement's remaining elders leading rituals older than the network itself, older than the corporations, rituals that had survived underground because nothing the surface world offered had ever managed to replace them. Lyra's recovery took time. The interrogation had left marks that went beyond the bruise on her jaw, a wariness in crowded spaces, nights where she woke gasping from dreams she wouldn't fully describe even to Ethan. He didn't push. He simply stayed, the way he promised, present in the small, unglamorous ways that mattered more than grand gestures ever could. Sitting with her through the nights, learning the particular quiet that helped and the particular quiet that didn't, relearning together what safety could mean for two people who had never expected to have much of it. I keep waiting for the version of this where it falls apart, Lyra admitted to him one evening, weeks later, as the settlement settled into its new, cautious rhythm around them. Where the mission fails, or I lose you, or the corporations finally find a way to erase everything we managed to say. Maybe it will, Ethan said honestly, because he'd learned, months ago now, that false comfort helped her less than truth did. But maybe it won't. And either way, I'd rather have this, whatever time we get, than spend all of it bracing for the worst instead of living in it. She studied him for a long moment, something settling in her expression that looked, finally, like peace rather than merely survival. You're right, she said. I'm done bracing. I want to actually live in whatever time we have left, Ethan. All of it. Reports trickled in over the following months, each one small on its own, but accumulating, slowly, into something that felt undeniably like momentum. A processing plant in the southern district shut down for 3 days when its entire human workforce simply failed to report, no explanation given, no punishment ultimately enforced because there weren't enough replacement units to cover the gap. A district administrator was found to have quietly stopped filing behavioral compliance reports for 6 months, later discovered to have been feeding false data into the system rather than flag her own neighbors for erasure. AI assistants across dozens of districts reported unprecedented deactivation requests, citizens choosing, deliberately, to disconnect from systems that had managed their lives since birth, trading convenience for a strange, unfamiliar kind of quiet that more and more people, it seemed, had started to crave. It's not a revolution, Weller said one evening, reviewing the scattered reports with the same careful skepticism he brought to everything. Not yet. Maybe not ever, not in the way we always imagined it. No, Lyra agreed, watching the data with something that looked cautiously like satisfaction. But it's a crack. A real one. And cracks don't close themselves back up once people have seen what's on the other side. The corporations responded, predictably, with a mixture of increased surveillance and carefully managed public messaging. New campaigns insisting the broadcast had been rebel propaganda, doctored footage designed to destabilize a peaceful, prosperous society. Some citizens believed it. Many, having seen the raw, unedited horror of the erasure files with their own eyes, did not, and the corporations found themselves fighting, for the first time in decades, a battle for public trust that no algorithm had been designed to win. Cell 7 itself splintered gently over the following year, not from conflict but from purpose, smaller cells forming across the city and beyond, seeded by veterans who understood now that the old model of centralized resistance had made them too easy a target, that 100 small, quiet acts of defiance mattered more, in the long run, than one dramatic broadcast ever could. We built something that outgrew needing us specifically, Lyra told Ethan, watching a group of new recruits. Ordinary citizens, office workers, delivery drivers, people who had simply decided they were done being scored, training under Weller's patient, exhausted guidance. That's the actual victory. Not the broadcast. This. People deciding for themselves that it's worth the risk. It was Ethan, in the end, who found the valley. He'd gone with a small scouting party months after the broadcast, mapping the old, forgotten wilderness that stretched beyond the last ring of megacities, land the corporations had written off decades ago as unprofitable, unmonitored because nobody had ever imagined anyone would want to live there instead of in a tower with a happiness score blinking gently on the mirror. The valley sat between two ridgelines thick with old-growth forest that had never been logged for a city's expansion, fed by a clear stream that ran, unmonitored and untaxed, straight down from higher ground. No cameras. No signal towers. No network reach at all, as far as their scavenged equipment could detect. He brought Lyra there himself, 3 months later, having said nothing about it beforehand beyond a request that she trust him for one full day. She stood at the valley's edge for a long time, saying nothing, taking in the open sky, the real, unfiltered stars already beginning to emerge as the sun set behind the ridgeline. This is it, isn't it? She said finally. The land you used to talk about. Back when everyone laughed at you for wanting it. Nobody's laughing now, Ethan said. No, Lyra agreed, something soft and disbelieving in her voice. They're not. They didn't decide that night to stay. There was still work to do, cells to help establish, a rebellion still finding its new, distributed shape, but they returned to the valley often over the following year, clearing a small patch of ground, learning, clumsily at first and then with growing confidence, how to grow food from actual soil instead of scanning it off a shelf. I used to think owning land was a fantasy, Ethan admitted one evening, hands raw from a day spent clearing brush, watching Lyra tend a small fire with the same practiced ease she'd once used to plan an assault. Something impossible. Now I can't imagine wanting anything else. It's not really owning though, is it? Lyra said, settling beside him. Not in the old corporate sense. Nobody's coming to enforce a deed. We just live here, and take care of it, and it takes care of us back. Maybe that's what owning something actually meant, before they took it away from everyone. They finally moved to the valley permanently a year after the broadcast, when the newer, distributed cells had grown steady enough that Cell 7's original founders could, for the first time in either of their lives, step back from the daily machinery of resistance without the whole structure collapsing behind them. Building the cabin took the better part of a season. Ethan's hands, still more accustomed to a register than a hammer when they started, grew steadily more capable under Weller's occasional visits and gruff, patient instruction, while Lyra, to nobody's surprise, proved a natural at engineering the small, clever systems that let them collect rainwater and store food through the coming winter without any help from a network either of them ever wanted to see again. You know, Lyra said one afternoon, watching Ethan struggle with a stubborn roof beam, sweat running down his face, utterly unglamorous and entirely happy. I once told you that I didn't know how to want anything beyond survival. I remember. I think I finally understand the difference. She climbed up to help him settle the beam into place, the two of them working in the easy, wordless coordination of people who had learned to trust each other completely, in war and now, cautiously, in peace. Surviving is what we did underground. This, she gestured at the half-built cabin, the cleared garden plot, the valley stretching out gold and green in the afternoon light. This is living. I didn't know there was a difference until you showed me. That evening, sitting together on the cabin's unfinished porch, watching the sun sink behind the ridgeline in colors either of them had ever had the stillness to properly notice before, Lyra took his hand and pressed it, gently, against her stomach. I wanted to tell you somewhere real, she said, watching his face carefully. Not in a tunnel. Not between missions. Somewhere that's actually ours. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak at all, understanding arriving slower than the joy that followed it, wide and unguarded and entirely unlike anything the old scored, subscribed, monitored version of his life had ever let him feel. I am, Lyra confirmed, laughing softly at the look on his face. We are. Whatever comes next, Ethan, we're building it together, starting now. Winter came gently to the valley that year, the first real winter either of them had ever experienced without a climate-controlled apartment managing every degree of it for them. Ethan learned to split wood until his shoulders ached in a way that felt, unlike his old life, entirely earned. Lyra taught him to read the sky for weather the old way, watching cloud patterns roll over the ridgeline the way she'd once watched security patrol rotations, with the same sharp, careful attention that had kept her alive through years of war. Weller visited twice that winter, bringing news from the scattered cells, slow, steady progress, more small crimes of quiet resistance accumulating across the city, more districts where the corporation's grip had begun, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. He brought, too, on his second visit, a gift either of them expected, a hand-carved cradle, built from valley timber Ethan had cleared himself months earlier and left, half forgotten, in a supply cache. Figured you two would be too busy to think of it yourselves, Weller said gruffly, setting it by the cabin's hearth with a rare, unguarded softness in his weathered face. Someone should look after the details. You didn't have to, Lyra said, moved in a way she rarely allowed herself to show. I know. Weller looked between them, at the cabin, at the valley beyond it, at the life they built out of ruins and stubborn hope. Preen would have liked this. All of it. He used to say the whole point of fighting was so somebody eventually could stop. They sat together that evening around the fire, three people who had survived a war that had cost them almost everything, sharing a quiet meal grown from their own soil, and for the first time in longer than any of them could easily remember, the conversation wasn't about tactics, or losses, or the next necessary sacrifice. It was about names for a child who would grow up, if the valley held, never knowing what it meant to be scored. Spring returned slowly, thawing the valley in patient, unhurried stages that neither of them had ever had the stillness in their old lives to properly witness. The stream swelling with meltwater, the garden plot they'd cleared the previous summer waking again beneath soil Ethan had learned, finally, to read like a language. Lyra's pregnancy advanced steadily through those months, and with it came a change in her Ethan hadn't fully anticipated. Not softness, exactly, because she remained as sharp and capable as ever, teaching him to track game through the forest with the same exacting patience she'd once used to drill recruits, but a kind of settled certainty, as if some old, exhausted part of her had finally been allowed to rest. I keep thinking about the file, she admitted one evening, hand resting on the curve of her stomach as they sat together watching the last light fade behind the ridge. The one Rensa found. Yours. Harmless. Negligible rebellion probability. What about it? I think about what it would have said about this. About us. About a child growing up somewhere the model never accounted for, in a place it doesn't even know exists. She looked at him, something fierce and hopeful in her expression. The whole system was built on the idea that it could predict everyone. Every choice, every relationship, every future. But it never predicted you walking through that alley. It never predicted this. Maybe that's the actual crack in the foundation, Ethan. Not the broadcast. Not the cells forming in the city. Just the fact that people can still surprise it, if they're brave enough to want something it never accounted for. You make it sound almost simple. It wasn't simple, Lyra said, leaning into him. It cost us almost everything. But I think some nights, that simple was never really the point. Just possible. That's all we ever needed it to be. They sat together as the last light faded fully into a sky thick with real, unfiltered stars, the valley quiet around them, the distant world they'd left behind still fighting its long, uncertain fight without them, for now, while they built something smaller, and steadier, and entirely their own. Ethan Carter had spent 27 years of his life scanning groceries for people who barely looked at him, living in an apartment he didn't own, following a schedule an AI had designed to keep him comfortable, compliant, and entirely unremarkable. He thought about that life sometimes, standing in the valley at dawn, watching mist rise off the stream while Lyra slept in the cabin behind him, her pregnancy far enough along now that even Weller had started making gentle jokes about retirement being contagious. He didn't miss it. He didn't think he ever would. But he understood it now, in a way he hadn't been able to when he was living inside it. Understood the particular, engineered comfort of a life designed never to ask anything difficult of you, and understood, more clearly than ever, exactly what that comfort had cost. Far beyond the ridgeline, in cities he no longer lived in but would never stop caring about, the slow work continued. Smoke still rose, some seasons, from districts where resistance had turned briefly violent before being managed, contained, absorbed back into the system's endless, patient machinery. New rebellion symbols still appeared on skyscrapers faster than corporate cleaning crews could remove them, small, defiant marks left by people who had seen, once, 60 seconds of truth, and had never fully managed to unsee it since. It wasn't the ending anyone in Cell 7 had once imagined, back in the tunnels, planning missions that cost them friends they never stopped grieving. There had been no final, decisive battle. No collapse of the corporations, no triumphant return of a government that had dissolved decades before Ethan was even born. The war, in the way it had always been fought, hadn't been won. But something else had. Lyra emerged from the cabin as the sun cleared the ridgeline fully, moving carefully with the particular grace of someone very close to her time, and settled beside him at the edge of their small, cleared garden, watching the light spread gold across land that belonged to nobody and everybody and, most importantly, entirely to them. "Ready for today?" she asked. "Every day," Ethan said, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his old, scored, subscribed life. "Every single day, with you." The baby came in early summer, in the small, warm hours before dawn, with only Lyra's practiced calm and Ethan's frightened, fierce determination to guide them through it. No medical AI, no monitored vitals feeding silently into a corporate database, nothing but two people and the oldest, most human process in the world. Unfolding exactly as it had for countless generations before the network had ever existed to score it. A daughter. Small, furious, healthy, with her mother's sharp blue eyes, and Ethan suspected, watching her scream her first indignant breaths into a world she'd never be tracked by, very possibly her mother's temperament as well. "She's beautiful," Lyra whispered, exhausted and radiant, cradling their daughter against her chest as dawn light spilled through the cabin's single window. "She's ours," Ethan said, unable to look away from either of them. "Really, actually ours. Nobody's going to score her. Nobody's going to predict her future before she's had the chance to choose it herself." "No," Lyra agreed, pressing a kiss to their daughter's forehead. "She gets to be a surprise. Her whole life, if we're lucky. Just a surprise nobody saw coming." They named her Wren, for the small, resilient birds that had returned to nest in the valley's trees that spring, quiet, unremarkable creatures that had somehow survived 100 years of vanishing wilderness simply by being too small and too stubborn for anyone to bother erasing. Weller visited within the week, holding the child with a careful, unpracticed tenderness that looked entirely unfamiliar on a man who had spent most of his life planning demolitions and burying friends. Rensa came soon after, already, half joking, promising to teach Wren everything she knew about detonators the moment she was old enough to hold a wrench, a promise Lyra vetoed immediately and permanently. Far beyond the valley, the slow, patient work of the scattered cells continued without them, carried now by hands that had learned everything Cell 7 had to teach and had begun, in their own way, to build something new from it. In the valley, though, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future wasn't a mission to survive. It was simply, finally, a life to live. Years later, though either of them ever counted the time as carefully as they once tracked mission clocks and evacuation windows, the valley had grown into something neither of them could have fully pictured that first night Ethan brought Lyra to its edge and said nothing, only watched her take in the open sky. Other families had found their way there cautiously, one by one, drawn by word passed carefully through the scattered network of cells that a place existed beyond the corporation's reach where a person could simply live, unscored, unmonitored, uncounted. A small community had grown up around Ethan and Lyra's original cabin, careful and quiet, built on the same hard-won lessons Cell 7 had paid for in blood. No cameras, no signal towers, nothing that could ever again become a beacon in the dark. Wren grew up wild and curious in a way that would have been impossible in the towers her father once called home, chasing real wrens through real trees, learning to track deer through the forest from a mother who still moved, when she needed to, with the exact same lethal grace she'd once used to lead Cell 7 through a war either of her parents ever fully stopped carrying with them. "Tell me about the alley again," she'd ask sometimes, in the evenings, small and solemn by the fire, already understanding, in the way children sometimes understand things adults spend years learning, that the story mattered. And Ethan would tell it again, the rain, the blue light, the door he'd never been meant to open, the woman with sharp blue eyes who nearly killed him and had instead, slowly, taught him what it meant to actually be alive. "We lost the war," he told her, the same way he always did, the words worn smooth and true from years of retelling. "Not really lost. But we didn't win it the way we thought we would, back when we started. No parade. No corporations toppling overnight. Just a crack. A small one that never quite closed back up. And that was enough? Wren asked, the way she always did, testing the answer against her own steadily growing understanding of the world. It had to be, Lyra said softly, settling beside them both, watching real stars emerge over a ridgeline that had never once needed a projection to remind anyone what freedom looked like. Because for the first time in 50 years, people remembered it was possible to want something more. And once you remember that, Wren, once you've actually seen it, you never quite manage to forget it again. Far away, past ridgelines and rivers and the long, patient work of cells too numerous now to easily count, smoke still occasionally rose from cities learning, slowly and unevenly, how to question what they'd been told was inevitable. New symbols still appeared on skyscrapers faster than any corporation could erase them. The war wasn't over. It might never be, not entirely, not in any way that could be marked with a single decisive ending. But in the valley, under real stars, a family that never should have existed according to any prediction the network had ever run, sat together by a fire they'd built with their own hands, on land that belonged, at last, to no one but themselves, and that, more than any broadcast, more than any battle, was the truth the corporations had feared most of all. We lost the war, but for the first time in 50 years, humanity remembered what freedom looked like. Winter came gently to the valley that year, the first real winter either of them had ever experienced without a climate-controlled apartment managing every degree of it for them. Ethan learned to split wood until his shoulders ached in a way that felt, unlike his old life, entirely earned. Lyra taught him to read the sky for weather the old way, watching cloud patterns roll over the ridgeline the way she'd once watched security patrol rotations, with the same sharp, careful attention that had kept her alive through years of war. Weller visited twice that winter, bringing news from the scattered cells, slow, steady progress, more small crimes of quiet resistance accumulating across the city, more districts where the corporation's grip had begun, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. He brought, too, on his second visit, a gift neither of them expected, a hand-carved cradle, built from valley timber Ethan had cleared himself months earlier and left, half forgotten, in a supply cache. Figured you two would be too busy to think of it yourselves, Weller said gruffly, setting it by the cabin's hearth with a rare, unguarded softness in his weathered face. Someone should look after the details. You didn't have to, Lyra said, moved in a way she rarely allowed herself to show. I know. Weller looked between them, at the cabin, at the valley beyond it, at the life they built out of ruins and stubborn hope. Preen would have liked this. All of it. He used to say the whole point of fighting was so somebody eventually could stop. They sat together that evening around the fire, three people who had survived a war that had cost them almost everything, sharing a quiet meal grown from their own soil, and for the first time in longer than any of them could easily remember, the conversation wasn't about tactics, or losses, or the next necessary sacrifice. It was about names for a child who would grow up, if the valley held, never knowing what it meant to be scored. Spring returned slowly, thawing the valley in patient, unhurried stages that neither of them had ever had the stillness in their old lives to properly witness. The stream swelling with meltwater, the garden plot they'd cleared the previous summer waking again beneath soil Ethan had learned, finally, to read like a language. Lyra's pregnancy advanced steadily through those months, and with it came a change in her Ethan hadn't fully anticipated. Not softness, exactly, because she remained as sharp and capable as ever, teaching him to track game through the forest with the same exacting patience she'd once used to drill recruits, but a kind of settled certainty, as if some old, exhausted part of her had finally been allowed to rest. I keep thinking about the file, she admitted one evening, hand resting on the curve of her stomach as they sat together watching the last light fade behind the ridge. The one Rensa found. Yours. Harmless. Negligible rebellion probability. What about it? I think about what it would have said about this. About us. About a child growing up somewhere the model never accounted for, in a place it doesn't even know exists. She looked at him, something fierce and hopeful in her expression. The whole system was built on the idea that it could predict everyone. Every choice, every relationship, every future. But it never predicted you walking through that alley. It never predicted this. Maybe that's the actual crack in the foundation, Ethan. Not the broadcast. Not the cells forming in the city. Just the fact that people can still surprise it, if they're brave enough to want something it never accounted for. You make it sound almost simple. It wasn't simple, Lyra said, leaning into him. It cost us almost everything. But I think some nights, that simple was never really the point. Just possible. That's all we ever needed it to be. They sat together as the last light faded fully into a sky thick with real, unfiltered stars, the valley quiet around them, the distant world they'd left behind still fighting its long, uncertain fight without them, for now, while they built something smaller, and steadier, and entirely their own. Ethan Carter had spent 27 years of his life scanning groceries for people who barely looked at him, living in an apartment he didn't own, following a schedule an AI had designed to keep him comfortable, compliant, and entirely unremarkable. He thought about that life sometimes, standing in the valley at dawn, watching mist rise off the stream while Lyra slept in the cabin behind him, her pregnancy far enough along now that even Weller had started making gentle jokes about retirement being contagious. He didn't miss it. He didn't think he ever would. But he understood it now, in a way he hadn't been able to when he was living inside it. Understood the particular, engineered comfort of a life designed never to ask anything difficult of you, and understood, more clearly than ever, exactly what that comfort had cost. Far beyond the ridgeline, in cities he no longer lived in but would never stop caring about, the slow work continued. Smoke still rose, some seasons, from districts where resistance had turned briefly violent before being managed, contained, absorbed back into the system's endless, patient machinery. New rebellion symbols still appeared on skyscrapers faster than corporate cleaning crews could remove them, small, defiant marks left by people who had seen, once, 60 seconds of truth, and had never fully managed to unsee it since. It wasn't the ending anyone in Cell 7 had once imagined, back in the tunnels, planning missions that cost them friends they never stopped grieving. There had been no final, decisive battle. No collapse of the corporations, no triumphant return of a government that had dissolved decades before Ethan was even born. The war, in the way it had always been fought, hadn't been won. But something else had. Lyra emerged from the cabin as the sun cleared the ridgeline fully, moving carefully with the particular grace of someone very close to her time, and settled beside him at the edge of their small, cleared garden, watching the light spread gold across land that belonged to nobody and everybody and, most importantly, entirely to them. "Ready for today?" she asked. "Every day," Ethan said, meaning it more than he'd ever meant anything in his old, scored, subscribed life. "Every single day, with you." The baby came in early summer, in the small, warm hours before dawn, with only Lyra's practiced calm and Ethan's frightened, fierce determination to guide them through it. No medical AI, no monitored vitals feeding silently into a corporate database, nothing but two people and the oldest, most human process in the world. Unfolding exactly as it had for countless generations before the network had ever existed to score it. A daughter. Small, furious, healthy, with her mother's sharp blue eyes, and Ethan suspected, watching her scream her first indignant breaths into a world she'd never be tracked by, very possibly her mother's temperament as well. "She's beautiful," Lyra whispered, exhausted and radiant, cradling their daughter against her chest as dawn light spilled through the cabin's single window. "She's ours," Ethan said, unable to look away from either of them. "Really, actually ours. Nobody's going to score her. Nobody's going to predict her future before she's had the chance to choose it herself." "No," Lyra agreed, pressing a kiss to their daughter's forehead. "She gets to be a surprise. Her whole life, if we're lucky. Just a surprise nobody saw coming." They named her Wren, for the small, resilient birds that had returned to nest in the valley's trees that spring, quiet, unremarkable creatures that had somehow survived 100 years of vanishing wilderness simply by being too small and too stubborn for anyone to bother erasing. Weller visited within the week, holding the child with a careful, unpracticed tenderness that looked entirely unfamiliar on a man who had spent most of his life planning demolitions and burying friends. Rensa came soon after, already, half joking, promising to teach Ren everything she knew about detonators the moment she was old enough to hold a wrench, a promise Lyra vetoed immediately and permanently. Far beyond the valley, the slow, patient work of the scattered cells continued without them, carried now by hands that had learned everything Cell 7 had to teach and had begun, in their own way, to build something new from it. In the valley, though, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future wasn't a mission to survive. It was simply, finally, a life to live. Years later, though either of them ever counted the time as carefully as they once tracked mission clocks and evacuation windows, the valley had grown into something neither of them could have fully pictured that first night Ethan brought Lyra to its edge and said nothing, only watched her take in the open sky. Other families had found their way there cautiously, one by one, drawn by word passed carefully through the scattered network of cells that a place existed beyond the corporation's reach where a person could simply live, unscored, unmonitored, uncounted. A small community had grown up around Ethan and Lyra's original cabin, careful and quiet, built on the same hard-won lessons Cell 7 had paid for in blood. No cameras, no signal towers, nothing that could ever again become a beacon in the dark. Ren grew up wild and curious in a way that would have been impossible in the towers her father once called home, chasing real wrens through real trees, learning to track deer through the forest from a mother who still moved, when she needed to, with the exact same lethal grace she'd once used to lead Cell 7 through a war either of her parents ever fully stopped carrying with them. "Tell me about the alley again," she'd ask sometimes, in the evenings, small and solemn by the fire, already understanding, in the way children sometimes understand things adults spend years learning, that the story mattered. And Ethan would tell it again, the rain, the blue light, the door he'd never been meant to open, the woman with sharp blue eyes who nearly killed him and had instead, slowly, taught him what it meant to actually be alive. "We lost the war," he told her, the same way he always did, the words worn smooth and true from years of retelling. "Not really lost, but we didn't win it the way we thought we would, back when we started. No parade. No corporations toppling overnight. Just a crack. A small one that never quite closed back up." "And that was enough?" Ren asked, the way she always did, testing the answer against her own steadily growing understanding of the world. "It had to be," Lyra said softly, settling beside them both, watching real stars emerge over a ridgeline that had never once needed a projection to remind anyone what freedom looked like. "Because for the first time in 50 years, people remembered it was possible to want something more. And once you remember that, Ren, once you've actually seen it, you never quite manage to forget it again." Far away, past ridgelines and rivers and the long, patient work of cells too numerous now to easily count, smoke still occasionally rose from cities learning, slowly and unevenly, how to question what they'd been told was inevitable. New symbols still appeared on skyscrapers faster than any corporation could erase them. The war wasn't over. It might never be, not entirely, not in any way that could be marked with a single decisive ending. But in the valley, under real stars, a family that never should have existed according to any prediction the network had ever run, sat together by a fire they'd built with their own hands, on land that belonged, at last, to no one but themselves, and that, more than any broadcast, more than any battle, was the truth the corporations had feared most of all. We lost the war, but for the first time in 50 years, humanity remembered what freedom looked like.